Good evening, friends, and shalom, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. Want to go ahead and briefly acknowledge anybody who is here in the live chat. I am currently seeing Kelby Quayo, Jamie Russell, Honesty Angel. I don't know if you're still here. It looks like you were here a little bit earlier. And Apologetics Squared, and as well as Kevin Blah as well. So shalom to all of you guys. Thank you very much for being here. Certainly appreciate you guys. Please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing if you are new to the channel and have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified of every time we go live. And definitely do consider, if you are interested, following me on the different social media platforms which we frequent here. I'm not going to go into them all today because there's a whole laundry list of things that I tend to say before, and I'm going to skip through ahead of them because we are somewhat limited on time. So I'll just briefly go with some of the brief reminders. I just want to remind you guys of the upcoming debates. December the 9th on Standing for Truth. You're going to be debating with Tested by Fire, Your Way or Yahweh. Is Jesus fully God and fully man? I say yes. He says no. That'll be on Standing for Truth December the 9th, and that'll certainly be interesting. December the 18th, I'll be teaming up with Jonathan Sheffield. We are going to take on Doctors Josh Bowen and Maggie Bryson on the question of whether or not the Exodus happened. We say yes. They say no. That'll certainly be a very fun conversation. And then December the 27th, I'm going to be having a debate on the gospel truth. There I'll be debating Rob Rowe. Does the Bible allow for death before the fall? I say yes, or so no, excuse me. He says yes, and that'll be my second debate with Rob Rowe. And then lastly, and this is actually a new one I have for you guys today, for the first time I can announce that I will be debating Tyler Vela, or Vela, I'm not sure how you say his last name, on Genesis 1 and Concordism. So that'll be pretty awesome as well. So we got a lot of, and that's on January the 2nd, and that'll once again be on Standing for Truth channel. So we got quite a few pretty awesome debates lined up. Praise the Lord for that, of course. And that's definitely, something where I am blessed higher than my pay grade, so to speak. But nonetheless, if you guys are interested in that, do definitely make sure to look those up. I think the thumbnails are up for all of them. You can hit the reminders and all that other kind of stuff. Get them shared to your different social media platforms and all that other kind of fun stuff. And that's, I'm saying the word stuff too much, but nonetheless, it's all good. That's what we got for that. Skipping ahead of a lot of stuff because I just criticized myself for overusing a word and then use the exact same word again. Anyways, let's get right into our prayer for today, because I think we have a very interesting conversation to have. And we actually have a guest in the back room who you may actually be able to see by the title already. So we're not going to keep our guests waiting too long. Let's go ahead and jump into our prayer, and then we'll go ahead and get started with this, what I think will be a very awesome video today. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for once again having the opportunity to make these videos, Lord Jesus, and to study the nature of you and your creation, Lord Jesus, of your word, of your relationship with us, Lord. I pray that you give us an anointing of the Holy Spirit here today, Lord, that we in the audience may only seek after you, seek after truth, Lord Jesus, and not try to seek after the victory of our own sides per se, Lord Jesus, or the glorification of our own names, but simply that you may be risen up, Lord Jesus, and that we may all be edified and come into closer relationship with you, and greater knowledge of you, Lord. I ask these things in Jesus Christ's name, and we give you the glory. Amen. All right, friends. So, little bit of background. Well, first off, I am joined by good brother in the Lord, Chris Date, for I think like the 5th or 6th time on this channel, which is awesome. Actually, this is I think. How do I say this? It's nice to have the I think I said this at the end of our last episode. It's nice to have the establishment of like other respectable people who like also consider you to be like allies and friends, because it seems like that means that things are going places. So I appreciate you being one of my evidences that things may potentially be going places. But thank you very much for being here. How's it going?
Really well. His name is Tyler Vela, by the way.
Hello?
And
okay.
And yeah, I will always come on your show, provided I continue to see you behave in the way that you do. Like I told you last time, I come on your show whenever you ask because I trust you. You've treated me and everybody that I've seen you interact with one possible exception, treat them with the utmost of respect and kindness. And to my knowledge, you've repented of the one person I have in mind whom you might not have been as gracious toward. So yeah. It's because you show me respect that I show you respect in turn. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I appreciate that tremendously. And we got a very fun episode for you guys here today. I want to give you guys a little bit of context. Over the last week, I've had 3 or 4 different live streams where we essentially, in all of them, started talking about different issues of predestination, essentially, and whether or not things were decreed by God, specifically evil things, whether or not Molinism was deterministic, a lot of other topics that had come up, but all in this general flavor of let's talk about God's decree, God's sovereignty, whether or not things are decreed indeed, and all that other kind of stuff. And what I wanted to do today was draw all of my thoughts together into a single kind of argument to try and essentially make the claim that Molinism comes to the same conclusion compatibilism Molinism is forced to come to the same conclusions compatibilism does about determinism and free will coexisting with each other, making it somewhat of a useless philosophy. In other words, what it seeks to defend, it does not actually defend. It just potentially, at least is my opinion, compromises on certain points. And I wanted to draw together all the thoughts there, but through a completely unrelated thing, Chris had actually started talking to me today, and then I started talking back about this particular thing, and so I ended up calling him. We ended up going back and forth about the argument here, and then what I had was not only greatly improved, but then it was also added to and built upon in a way that made it fundamentally different than what it was. And so we decided we were going to come on together and actually explain this particular view, see what you guys have to think about it, potentially get some people to respond, have some interaction here, and hopefully this will all be for good edification for the body as we move forward. But we are somewhat limited on time. So before I get into, I'm going to jump right into some of the points. But before I do, is there anything else that you would like to add here?
Number one, I'm sorry for the somewhat blue hue or tint of my camera. My wife is our photographer at church, and we're in a church that has very yellow walls and everything, and so she has to adjust the camera's white balance and stuff, and we forgot to change it back before I started using it tonight, so I apologize for that. The other thing I'll just mention is, since Standing for Truth is in the channel, he mentioned in the chat that I have a debate on his channel coming up on January, early January. I can't remember the exact date. He could say in the chat, but a debate with the Muslim apologist Shabir Ali. And I just yesterday I debated another Muslim apologist named Jake Brancatella, the so-called Muslim metaphysician. I was very pleased with how that debate went, and now I'm really excited for what I think will be an even easier debate with Dr. Ali. So yeah, people should be keeping their eye on the Standing for Truth channel in early January for that debate. I guess that's. Oh, I'll say one other thing. I know that hell isn't the topic of our discussion today, but I do just want to say that we aren't at Rethinking Hell. We are doing our annual conference this year, but we are doing it entirely online, and it's coming up at the end of December, on December 30th. So if people want to, and I can tell you some of the names. I will be one of the speakers. Braxton Hunter of Trinity Radio will be one of the speakers. J. Richard Middleton, I think is his name. He will be one of the speakers. Also, I think Jeff Cook will be one of the speakers. I think Paul Vanderclay is going to be a speaker. So there's going to be some good names there. And if people want to check out more and register for the online conference, they can go to Rethinking Hell Conference, all one word, .com, and sign up there. So I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. And definitely check out the channel, Rethinking Hell, as well, if you guys are interested in some different perspectives on hell. I know a lot of you guys know my position on hell, being annihilation. For those of you who are unaware, that is also Chris's position, and he's far more able to articulate that position than I am.
I've just been arguing for it longer than you have. That's all.
Well, I appreciate that. But it is still true nonetheless, and I think you're actually one of the best with that one. So definitely check that out, guys, if you're interested. Well, let's go ahead and get right into this because we have some pretty interesting stuff, I think, to get into. So the first thing, and the reason that this is going to be explained today is because I myself was struggling with it earlier this week. I then did a poll, and as it turns out, pretty much everybody else was struggling with this too. I know this because the poll ended up being a solid 50-50 with 24 votes, which obviously isn't everybody here on the channel, but it's a good deal of the people who watch this consistently, which means that it would be wise for me to articulate this following, basically the legitimacy of modus ponens in certain cases, and what it is and what it isn't. Knowing, by the way, that what I had actually very, if I could just be blunt, very arrogantly argued for against Danny about a week ago was actually wrong. I was definitely wrong. I think I have, I'm fairly certain I have a solid grasp on how to articulate my point solidly. We're going to see that today, but I definitely know where I articulated it wrong there. And Chris here was gracious enough to go through that with me, as was Danny himself going through multiple times. So, but nonetheless, I think it'll be wise to lay that forward and then explain why that's relevant to everything that we kind of have here. So really quickly, I'm going to just explain that here. And I appreciate any of the rest of you guys who were on my side of that poll, but we were incorrect. So I'm sorry for misleading you. Anyways, so the formula is if A, then B, A, therefore B. So, for example, if John is a bachelor, John is unmarried. John is a bachelor, therefore John is unmarried. Another example could be if Fido is a dog, he is a mammal. Fido is a dog, therefore he is a mammal, right? And you could have a couple other examples too. You could say, like, for example, if well, shoot, I was just about to give an example that wouldn't actually be particularly good, but you guys get the idea, right? If A, then B, and so long as B logically follows from A, you have yourself a functioning syllogism, right? It doesn't work.
A valid syllogism.
Yes, excuse me, a valid syllogism. It doesn't work if you do not have true statements. Like, for example, you could say, because if cucumbers are green, butterflies can fly. Obviously, that's not going to, right? Because that's just complete nonsense. Your syllogism isn't valid.
Hold on. Just to be as precise as we can, if you had a syllogism that began with if roses are red, then butterflies fly, and then you have the next premise, which is roses are red, and then the conclusion is butterflies fly, that would be a valid syllogism. It's just that it would be I don't know what the right word for it is. I've already forgotten. It would be false because the first premise is false. But it would be a valid syllogism. Anyway, sorry.
but you guys get the idea of what I'm trying to say, right? Like if A doesn't, or if B doesn't logically follow from A, then it doesn't provide the truth value that it could. But so long as A does logically follow from B and A is actually true, then you have yourself a good argument here when you actually operate with this, right?
Soundness. By the way, soundness was the word I was looking for. Jamie put it. So there's validity and there's soundness. A syllogism is valid provided the conclusion follows from the premises, but it's sound if the premises are true and the conclusion follows from the premises. Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, actually, I appreciate that a lot, Jamie. Thank you very much. If A, then B, A, therefore B, and again, you had the bachelor and the dog example there, right? So the idea is B must be true if A is true. That is to say, at all times in which A is true, B is also true, and at all times in which B is true, at all times in which B is false, A is also false. That is not to say that that B cannot be true independent of A being true. It's just to say that, like, so for example, in the bachelor example, you'd say, at all times that John is a bachelor, he is unmarried, and at all times that John is married, he is not a bachelor, right? So that's not to say the consequent B is true by necessity. It's not to say that the consequent B is not true in any possible world, or that it can't eventually become true, or that it may not have been true in the past. It's just simply to say that if A is true, then B is also true. And if B is false, A is also false.
Yeah, I think the fallacy known as affirming the consequent is the fallacy of mistakenly saying that if A therefore B, then if B therefore A.
Yeah.
That would be false. So you're right. If A then B would mean if not B then not A. That's true. But to say if A then B and then say, well then if B then A, that would be the fallacy of affirming the consequent.
And thank you for that, right? Because it's actually very good for me to have you here because you're more technically precise than I am.
I'm looking this stuff as I'm saying it. I don't have all this stuff in my head. I'm still learning logic.
So this is not to say once again that it's true by necessity or that it's true in all possible worlds, right? But to give an example of where it is true is to say like it's possible that John was married. It's possible that John could get married. It's possible that John is married in another timeline at this current point in time. In other words, if a different series of events had occurred, he could be married now. It's not possible, however, that John is married and also a bachelor simultaneously, right? So in the bachelor example, we have an antecedent that is subject to change. In other words, John could become married at a point in time, and then he would cease being a bachelor, right? Which is partially mentioned earlier. And so I decided to say that this has a conditional truth value, meaning that it is subject to change at any point in time. In other words, once the antecedent is true, it doesn't have to remain true. But if A is not subject to change, then B and A can both be said to have a permanent truth value, meaning that they will always be true. To give an example of this, if John was born, he was born of a mother. John was born, therefore John was born of a mother. It is not necessary that John was born, so it's not as if B is a necessary truth, that John was born of a mother. But it is true every time that if John is born, he is born of a mother. And if indeed John was born, that is a permanent truth. He doesn't become not born of a mother, right? He can die, but that doesn't change the fact that he was born, nor does it change the fact that he was born of a mother. In other words, it's a permanent truth. Real quickly, if you think I've said anything that needs comment on, definitely go ahead and comment at the moment. Sorry, I just don't want to rush too fast.
No, I think you're good.
Cool. And so there's a reason why it's important to point out what I just referenced here as immutable antecedent, but this antecedent that can't change once it's true, right? For example, just being born one. Because what you have here is then both truths end up being permanent truths, right? And if you have a situation where it's kind of like a chronological modus ponens, for lack of a better term. In other words, if A is, B will be, kind of a thing. So you could say like if you hit a baseball, it will have forward momentum in the direction in which you hit it. That's something that's like a chronological thing, right? Kind of like dominoes. And so it's important to note, I think, that particular aspect of certain antecedents as well. Not all antecedents are necessarily that kind of if A then B, but some of them could be, right? So then if you plug in some Molinistic terms here, so in Molinism, God has all of the different potential timelines in front of him, so to speak. That is to say that he has knowledge of every decision that every person could make in every possible situation in which he would create them, right? This is what's known as middle knowledge or Molinism. And if I am remembering correctly, these are called subjunctive conditionals, right?
Yeah, they're conditionals because it's if God were to create or to actualize that world, and they're subjunctive because it's the then such and such would happen. So the if is the conditional, the would is the subjunctive, and the Molinistic assertion is that the truth value of these of a virtually infinite number of subjunctive conditionals gives God a number of possible worlds from which to choose one to actualize.
Right. And so, by the way, to briefly, just because I want to make sure people don't think that this is being strawmanned or anything, I want to show a very brief, about minute and 20-second clip from the William Lane Craig James White debate, just simply where the host reiterates Craig's position, and Craig confirms where he's true and corrects where he is false about it. I didn't word that correctly, but you guys know what I'm trying to say. Confirms where he got it accurate and where he didn't, in a way that is technically accurate, so that we can get a solid definition of what exactly is meant by Molinism, at least in one particular Molinist example. Obviously, I can't give an exhaustive list of all Molinists, but nonetheless. So let me go ahead and share my screen really quick here so that we can get the clip. And it's right here. And there's an ad, of course. Here, I'll stop sharing for the moment until this is done. All right. So, and again, the idea is that, go ahead.
You know what you need to do, CJ, is you need to get a program called 4K Video Downloader. And what I do when I want to show clips is I will use that tool to go download the video that is up on YouTube onto my local machine. And that way you can play clips without ads at your will. But anyway, go ahead.
Actually, did not know that. I'm definitely going to have to look into that. See, and that would be useful for me because I play a lot of clips from straight from YouTube rather than like pirating them or downloading them. I guess it's not pirating, right? Because you don't buy them. But nonetheless, I don't tend to download them. I tend to just go straight to YouTube to find them because it's already there, right? It's just like unnecessary to take up space on my computer. So that might be very useful, I think. So William Lane Craig is going to explain exactly what the position Molinism is here to be, and in a technically precise way, right? And just to say one more time, to reiterate the position as I had said it, and then you can say if you can look at whether or not I'm accurately representing it. It's the idea that God has middle knowledge, which is knowledge of these subjunctive conditionals, and that is to say that he knows what any individual would do in any situation given the circumstances in which he creates them, right? And William Lane Craig will add some of the important details that I, as somebody who's not a Molinist, may miss here in this portion. So let me go ahead and play it.
And it involves this concept which you've alluded to, middle knowledge, this idea that God can see all of the possible worlds that could exist, and what people would do under different circumstances, and then presumably instantiates that world in which his ultimate purposes are fulfilled, while not, as you say, overriding the free will, because people are still freely choosing to do what they will do, but God is, as it were, set up the conditions knowing what they will ultimately freely choose to do. Is that am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, that was very close, Justin. I would just be careful to use the subjunctive mood, that he knows what they would do, not what they will do, because he may, seeing what they would do, decide, oh, wait a minute, I don't want to create that world. I'm going to make another one instead. And so what they will do can be quite different than what they would do under certain circumstances. So it's a very carefully articulated view.
And part of the reason you want this very...
Sorry. All right. So the idea, as you can see, is God has knowledge, like I said, of all possible situations and of all possible choices that an individual would freely make in those situations. And then he freely chooses to actualize, one of those worlds based on the foreknowledge which he already has of those subjunctive conditionals. So you could use modus ponens to basically say Molinism.
I'm sorry, CJ. Are you saying modus ponens or modus tollens?
Ponens.
Ponens. Okay, let's make sure.
Yeah, I think I just said Polens.
I think you did
and
too.
mixed the two together.
Okay.
So I think that's what you probably caught there, to be honest.
That's all right. No
now
worries.
when you said that, I think I thought about it and I was like, I'm pretty sure I just said Polens. Modus ponens, excuse me. But basically, you could explain it as, so if God actualizes timeline A, event, well, you could explain a certain portion, a certain aspect of it as, if God actualizes timeline A, then event A will occur. God has actualized timeline A, therefore event A will occur. So what we see here that and this is what I initially wanted to point out, right, is two very important, what I would call bullets to bite, so to speak, for the Molinist, that puts them in the same position as the compatibilist, although with a caveat that does definitely need to be noted for the sake of honesty, right? The caveat being that they do believe these things are ultimately determined by libertarian free will, but I'll get there in just a second. So the two things that I want to point out is, number one, the agent in event A is not actually able in a true sense to do anything other than what was already predetermined by the actualizing of timeline A. In other words, in order for somebody to have done, for example, event B or C or so on and so forth, then timeline B or C or so on and so forth would have had to have been actualized, right? But since timeline A was actualized, only event A, and of course the other different events that would happen, but I'm just trying to very much simplify this for the sake of telling you guys what it is, right? Would be able to happen afterwards. Which I think I wouldn't, I was originally going to use a term that was perhaps a little bit too strong here, so I'll just say this. I think it dampens the free will in a very serious way. Although the Molinists would say to this, well, the reason that this was chosen in this particular timeline was still based on the free will which God foreknew, and which they libertarianly chose, right? It wouldn't say that it was caused, in other words, by the by God himself, right? That it was actually libertarianly chose by the free agent, and that God just simply actualized that for whichever purposes he decided to actualize that world, which varies from Molinist to Molinist, right? But nonetheless, you still do see the kind of the point, though, of it, you almost have like a domino effect here in a way of this event not actually being able to occur in a true sense because the timeline has already been predetermined at the beginning. And that's the first thing. The second thing to point out here is, if event A is, say, a immoral act, then that would mean that the immoral act would have to occur based on the actualization of time. In other words, if event A is an immoral event, it would have to occur based on the actualization of timeline A, which is ultimately done by God and for his own sovereign choices. So to plug some things in, right?
Well, hold on. Well, okay. Yeah, you go ahead and I'll come back.
Okay. So to plug some things in, God can, and I'm only going to list three here. There's a whole, the Molinists would have a whole bunch of different worlds here, but just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to list three different possible worlds here, right? So let's say that God has in front of him a world in which there is a World War II, a world in which there is not a World War II, and then no world at all, right? God has the, and obviously there's multiple more than just this, but this is just for the sake of simplicity, narrowing it down to three, right? God, in, let's call it event A, or a timeline A, which is the timeline we're currently in, where there is a World War II, sees that event taking place, and then in timeline B, sees that event not taking place. He also could choose to go with, you could call it timeline C, or really it would be timeline X in a way, because there'd be nothing there, right? Where he just doesn't create at all. But he decides to actualize timeline A for his own sovereign and righteous purposes, right? Now,
I just want to chime in for a second and just make clear to viewers that when you say God sees this world and sees this world, we're not saying that Molinism posits God sort of passively taking in knowledge through the sense perception or, anything like that. You're just speaking colloquially. What you mean is that in the timeless instant in which God exists, he knows exactly, he knows that the Holocaust will happen if he actualizes timeline A. He knows the Holocaust will not happen if he actualizes timeline B, and then he also knows that nothing will happen if he actualizes no timeline at all.
Exactly. And then he decides on his own, by his own sovereign choice and for his own righteous purposes, to actualize timeline A rather than timeline B or no timeline at all, right? So the point here being that the original 2 points that I was wanting to make is this not God decreeing evil, number one? And number two, if the agent can't actually do anything other than what was decreed by the actualization of their timeline, then in what way are they free in creation? Now, at that point, Chris State had some pretty interesting answers to Steelman the opposition for me, and I think that led us to some very interesting places. So I wanted to share that with you guys because I do think it's a very solid argument to present, but I think it gets a little bit more solid with some of the stuff that my brother can add here. So go right ahead and take over, and also correct anything I said that needs correction.
I don't think anything needs correcting. So the steel manning that I did when you and I were on the phone earlier today is I said, and I take the following to actually mean that the argument you just offered may not be quite as strong as you think it is, because what I pointed out is that sure, in the world God actualizes at the moment of decision, it's necessarily the case that that the agent will do A. That's true. However, and this went over my head and it went over the head of all the audience when I saw this happen, but I understand it now. Back in like 2014 or somewhere around there, I went up to Canada for an Apologetics Canada conference, and William Lane Craig was one of the speakers, and during the Q&A, somebody asked him about a question along these kinds of lines. And what he said is, or I'll paraphrase based on the analogy we're using or the hypothetical we're using, what he said was, it is necessarily the case that the agent chooses A in this timeline, this world that God has chosen to actualize, but it's not the case that the agent will necessarily choose that event A, choice A. Notice I moved where the word necessarily goes, and everybody in the audience was laughing, including me. Nobody understood what he was saying, but I get it now. What he's saying is that the difference between Calvinistic compatibilism, which is a form of determinism, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Molinist position, the difference is that we as determinists will say it is in fact necessary that the agent necessarily chooses option A because God has decreed that the agent performs choice A. But the Molinist says, no, it is true that necessarily the agent chooses option A in the world he actualizes, but the agent doesn't do it necessarily. The agent does it freely because the world, in the possible world God chose not to actualize, the agent didn't choose choice A. So the agent has freely, in the strongest libertarian sense, chosen in one timeline to do A and in one timeline not, these two possible worlds, and God actualizes the one in which he does. So because God has actualized that world, it is necessary that the agent choose A, but the agent doesn't choose it necessarily. He chooses it freely. Whereas in our compatibilistic determinism, the agent necessarily chooses A because God has decreed that the agent will do it. And so that was a steel manning I did. And so what it does, and this is the way I've started to think about it, there's a logical relationship between God's choice to create and an agent's choice to act. And as determinists, we think that the agent's choice to act follows logically from God's decree to create. But in Molinism, it's the other way around. God's decision to create follows the agent's choice to act, because he's choosing from among possible worlds in which the agent acts freely and in different ways in each possible world. So as far as I can tell, there is this one difference, and I think it may be this difference and this difference alone, maybe, that separates Calvinism and, a compatibilist, deterministic form of Calvinism and Molinism, is this relation, this contingency relationship, or this logical relationship between God's decree to create and a human act. But of course, this is where Dr. White pushed so strongly during that debate with Dr. Craig that you just played a clip from, because if that's how a Molinist is going to explain it, then the Molinist has to affirm, and does affirm, that God has infallible knowledge of what an agent would do in any possible world. And Dr. White pushed back on this with what's called the grounding objection. And even one of your viewers in the chat has issued the grounding objection. Nicholas, proclaimer of Messiah, in the chat said, where does the free agent come from that its will can pre-exist God's decisions? And that is the grounding objection. How could God know? So let's take a step back. And by the way, at any time, CJ, feel free to chime in. I don't want to take over your show or anything. And in fact, to be perfectly honest, I'm going to be tempted to ask you questions along the way just to get you back in, because I don't want to hog the spotlight. But the whole point of middle knowledge, the reason it's called middle knowledge, is because previous to Molina's speculations, his proposals, there were two categories of God's knowledge that were acknowledged. There was God's free knowledge, which is the knowledge that God has of what he will do because he's the one that does it. He's the one that will do it, so he knows that he'll do it. But then there's also his, I think it's called natural knowledge, which is his knowledge of what happens in the world, what anybody else does, anything else that happens in the world. And what Molina proposed and what Molinists seize upon is the hypothetical category of knowledge in between those two. His knowledge, not of what he will freely do, and not his knowledge of what created people will do, but rather what people would do if he were to create them. And this, your viewer, Nicholas, proclaimer of Messiah, is making the same point that Dr. White did in the debate, which is, how could God... Think of it this way. Our choices, no matter how free you want to say they are nevertheless heavily influenced by a massive confluence of issues, factors. The particular situation in which the agent finds himself, the life experiences that the person has leading up to that point, the person's upbringing, the person's genetics, the person's prenatal development, all of this, and much, much more, including, at its foundation, the nature with which God creates the agent. So among this massive confluence of factors that shape our choices, no matter how free they are, among this massive confluence of factors is God's decision to create the agent in such and such way. Well, so what Nicholas is asking... Go ahead.
I just want to point out really quickly what you heard William Lane Craig kind of say that kind of is hinting towards that is, he said, I think that, I don't know if this was in the clip or if this is in something a little bit earlier when he was talking about the Charles Dickens story, A Christmas Carol, but he says that there is the category of in between what will happen and what may happen only what would happen given a certain set of circumstances,
Right.
which is kind of a really, I think, boiled down way of saying that if all of these different events go in such and such a way, the agent will do this, or this will logically follow.
Yeah, and one important thing here is that this decision is not something that God is making at various points along the, throughout time, multiple times after he creates. This is a decision he makes from the moment of creation, which is to say, it's not just that he knows in what circumstances the agent will find him or herself in, it's that God knows from the moment of creation, and however many thousands of years, or if you're an older creationist or theistic evolutionist, how many millions of years transpire from the moment of the Big Bang to the point where the agent makes a decision, all of that, he knows what all of that will look like leading up to the moment at which the agent chooses, and he knows which choice the agent will make in that condition. But going back to the grounding objection issue, notice the question that Nicholas and Dr. White were getting at. If one of the factors that shapes our choice is the nature God has given us, the nature with which God has created us, me to be me, the talents, the gifts, the proclivities, the personality traits that God chooses to create me with, those are all factored into the things that shape my decision making. And what Nicholas and Dr. White are wanting to ask is, well, in these other possible worlds in which God hasn't, in fact, created anyone yet, how could he possibly know what agents would do? And that was like the whole thing that they focused on in that conversation, even though that's not really what the topic was about. And so that was what led you and I, that focus on the grounding objection is what then spurred you and I to discover some other things. Do you want me to go on, or do you want to ask some questions, or?
Well, so there is, I think a little bit more to be added, I think, from your perspective here, or from your side here, before I actually ask some of the questions, because mine are sort of like preloaded in a way, just because we had this conversation earlier, you know what I mean? But I do just want to briefly point out that this objection was in the debate handled by James White, at least, by postulating the existence of pre-creative essences, and that's not what Dr. Craig actually wanted to defend. So he said that was not the case, but actually put forward what Chris is kind of talking about right now, where it's like the collection of all of the different decisions and events which lead up to these decisions that lead the free agent to choose what it would choose in any sort of circumstance. But that is the only reason I bring that up, is just to say that there is also that particular position that I guess hypothetically you could take. I don't know anybody who would want to, but nonetheless, you could potentially go the route of saying that human beings have some kind of pre-existent essence that God basically has to deal with like a deck of cards, I guess.
But then human beings' essences are as eternal as God is, and nobody's going to go that direction except for Mormons. And
that's sort of the point, though, is just to say, like, I almost think you're forced into the position which Dr. Craig himself did defend in this interview, right? But go ahead, sorry.
Well, if what you mean is they're forced to affirm that the knowledge that God has of the decision somebody will make in a possible world is based on not just that moment, but all the life events leading up to that person's choice. And I don't see that as being like forced to defend it. I've just taken for granted that that's what Molinists mean. And I think they, for the most part, do. I think that it's we Calvinists who sometimes assume that when the Molinist says that when an agent makes a choice in a possible world, God knows it without respect to everything leading up to that point. I think we're the ones making the mistake there. However, and in fact, when I watched this debate between Drs. Craig and White, something occurred to me, which is, it seems to me that there's a really, really, really obvious and simple and straightforward answer to the grounding objection. This objection that, look, if God hasn't yet created the agent, how could he know what they will do? And the answer is really simple. It is that collection of subjunctive conditionals, the subjunctive conditionals that define a possible world, includes the creative decree of God. What God would create the world to be in that possible world. The nature with which God would create the agent in that possible world. Right? So obviously, I mean, the whole point of God being a necessary being is that he is necessary in all possible worlds. There couldn't be a world that exists without him being the creator of it. And what that means then is in any one of these possible worlds, God has, it's not merely that an agent would do such and such, it's that God would have created the agent with whatever nature the agent ends up having at the time that they make the choice they would in that possible world. Right? So, and at that point, what gap is left in the grounding? I mean, the whole gap in the grounding objection is God hasn't decreed to create them. But if that list of subjunctive conditionals just includes the way God would create them in that possible world, well, now you've grounded it. Or so it seems to me. But I think that while that solves the grounding objection, and I'd be interested to hear what others in the chat think and whether this does in fact solve the grounding objection. If it does, I think it introduces another problem, but I'll wait to get to that until we get to it. Did you want to come back on any of that?
No, for now, I am actually kind of going to let you just take the reins for a minute. Okay. Because at the end of this, I think that there's a lot of things that I would like to add, because essentially what I presented earlier is a incomplete argument that like has a level of strength there, but ultimately has some things lacking in it. And then I think what you provide here is what actually makes it a full argument, which is a big part of the reason why I would like you to, or why I wanted you here tonight, right? Because I think that's sort of like, it does work together like that. And so it's not just fully my point even too, right? That's another thing. Is like in order for the point to even be fully articulated, it would be, it would behoove me to give credit to half of the articulator, right? But nonetheless, so I don't have any comments so far.
Okay. Well, so here's what I want to do. And I spent a little bit of time before this show, after you and I spoke, talking to Dr. Tim Stratton, who is one of the world's, I think, premier Molinists. He's not far, I think, behind Dr. Craig in that regard. And Dr. Stratton is, by the way, both a friend and a colleague at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, where I teach. So if people want to learn from... See, this is, by the way, this is one of the beautiful things about Trinity Seminary, and I hope people will check out... TrinitySem.edu, Trinity SEM, short for seminary, TrinitySem.edu, because one of the things I'm so thrilled and excited and proud about what Braxton is doing at Trinity is he's getting a group of teachers who not only are great academics, which you can get at some great seminaries, but also have very public ministries. I mean, we're talking Leighton Flowers of Soteriology 101, Tim Stratton of Rethinking Ministries, Jonathan Pritchett and Braxton Hunter of Trinity Radio, me, Steve Gregg, and others, Chris Featherstone. And here's the cool thing about all of them, too, and this is what I was ultimately getting to here. We hold to a wide variety of positions on the non-essentials of the faith. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I think that's the way a Christian seminary should run, that you should have a variety of professors who have a diversity of views on the non-essentials, but all agree on the essentials. So I just wanted to give that plug for Trinity. But anyway, I spoke with Dr. Stratton for a little bit before the show, and I ran by him some thoughts, and I think he affirmed them for the most part, but he had to go before I could get to the punchline. I'm going to get to the punchline with you, but what I want viewers to make sure they understand is that what I'm offering here, what I'm about to offer, is a very inchoate or underdeveloped, nascent argument that may prove to be poop. It may prove to be a bad argument given sufficient scrutiny. I've only had,
Yeah,
I've
as
only
is
literally,
everything I've presented too, just to be clear.
yeah. You and I spent some time. We spent a good hour and a half, I think, on the phone thinking through these issues. And what we're presenting today, including what I'm about to present, is underdeveloped and subject to scrutiny. And I'm throwing it out there so that others will start helping me think through this, including yourself, CJ. So here's what I want to do. In short, I think that what I've offered solves the grounding objection in a beautifully simple way. The problem is that I think that it ends up reducing Molinism to no significant difference with determinism. So that's in a nutshell the argument I'm about to make, and I'll lay it out. Again, this is very underdeveloped, but we'll see how it goes. So what I want to do is walk you through a hypothetical conversation that I've written out between a Calvinist and a Molinist. All right. And along the way, I'll offer some commentary. And I think that by the time the conversation is over, people will see what argument I think there might be to be made. So I have witnessed many conversations and been a part of many conversations myself that go something like this. You'll have a Molinist talking to a Calvinist, and the Molinist will say something like, hey, Mr. Calvinist, in your view, people aren't free because it's not possible for them to choose otherwise. And the Calvinist, many of them, will respond, well, but that's just one view of freedom. That's libertarian freedom, and moreover, it's a specific kind or definition of libertarian freedom, namely the one based on the principle of alternative possibilities. But I reject not only the alternate possibilities view of freedom, I reject libertarianism full stop. I think that people are free in the sense that they choose exactly what they want. They choose according to their nature. And so then the Molinist, and we think as Calvinists, hey, yeah, that solves the problem. Au contraire, the Molinist responds. In your view, God gives the agent that nature. So God's still the one responsible. God is the one who has determined their desires, their nature, created them with the nature they have. And so he's still responsible for the thing that determines the choice they make. On my view, however, and again, this is the hypothetical Molinist speaking, on my view, God can be said to be sovereign over all events in time in the same way you do, Mr. Calvinist, but I think it's because he chooses to actualize one possible world over all others. And in all such worlds, including the one that he actualizes, people choose and could have chosen otherwise. Nothing prevented them from choosing otherwise than they did. The true subjunctive conditionals that make up God's middle knowledge enabled him to know what libertarian free agents would do in any possible world, and he actualizes one possible world. So while he is sovereign over all events in time in the sense that he actualizes a world in which he knows exactly what will transpire, and could have transpired in a different way, nevertheless, agents are acting freely. And so then the Calvinist responds, okay, but if God hasn't yet decreed to create those agents, how can God know what they will do? The will of agents is influenced by a host of influences, including the nature with which God creates them. How, therefore, can God know what agents would do in a possible world when he hasn't yet created them with their individual natures? So notice, by the way, I've caught us up in this hypothetical conversation to the grounding objection, and we just spent some time on that. So now, I'm going to put myself in the shoes of this hypothetical Molinist and offer the solution that I just did a moment ago, all right? Oh, well, that's easy, Mr. Calvinist. The natures with which God would create agents is among those subjunctive conditionals that influence his decision as to which possible world to actualize. So in any possible world, God's knowledge of what an agent would do under any given circumstances is grounded in his knowledge of the nature with which he would create the agent in that possible world. The subjunctive conditionals that make up any possible world would include all the events in time that lead up to the moment of the agent's choice, including the nature with which God would have created that agent in that possible world. Grounding problem solved. And now speaking for myself, Chris again, I actually think that it strikes me as a solution to the problem. But, and this is where I'm going to start getting to the conclusion of my argument, it seems to me to raise another problem. So now I'm the Calvinist again, responding to the Molinist's proposed solution to the grounding problem. Well, hold on, Mr. Molinist. You objected to my view because even if an agent chooses what he wants according to his nature, God created him with that nature in the real world, the one I'm talking about, thereby making him responsible. But now you're telling me that in the possible worlds whose subjunctive conditionals influence God's decision of which possible world to actualize, God's knowledge of what an agent would do is grounded in his knowledge of the nature with which he would have created that agent. Aren't you back to the exact same problem? Well, and so now let's say the Molinist responds, well, hold on. I think God creates agents with natures that are consistent with multiple possible choices. Given this or that particular nature, an agent might conceivably choose from among several different options, each of which is fully consistent with his nature. So the agent is still free, unlike in your view. And by the way, this is exactly what Dr. Stratton said to me on the phone before this show. He said to me, in a possible world at the moment of choice, there may be multiple choices available to that agent that are consistent with his nature. All right. So now Mr. Calvinist responds, well, hold on. The very definition of possible world semantics means that if God would create an agent with a nature which could be consistent with multiple free choices, then a possible world exists for each of those choices. In other words, if a possible world exists in which an agent with a particular nature chooses option A, but could have equally chosen option B or option C, then that's not one possible world with three different possible choices. It's three different worlds. Three different possible worlds. In one of them, the agent would choose A. In another one, the agent would choose B. And in another one, the agent would choose C. And so then, right? And so then the Molinist responds, well, but not all those options are guaranteed to be feasible, though. So it may be three possible worlds, but fewer feasible worlds. By the way, that's exactly what Dr. Stratton said to me on the phone. And now we're going to get to my conclusion, all right? So now the Calvinist responds, okay, hold on. All right, but hold on. Let's say that while the agent could conceivably choose option C, there are extenuating factors that make that world infeasible. So now we have three possible worlds, but only two feasible worlds. The one in which the agent would choose A, and the one in which the agent would choose B. And then God chooses to actualize the first of these feasible worlds. That means that God chooses, not just from among possible worlds which to actualize, in which the agent makes free choices. That's sort of the way that Molinism is presented, but that's very incomplete. The reality is that God chooses in a possible world to create an agent with the nature that led to only two feasible worlds, and he chooses to actualize one of those feasible worlds and not the other. So God creates the agent the way he creates him, knowing that it will delimit the choices available to the agent, and knowing that the world he actualizes is the world in which the agent picks the one of the two delimited choices that he chooses to actualize. And that seems to me to say, so anyway, I mean, that's a conclusion. In other words, this idea that somehow God gets off the hook in Molinism because he's choosing from among possible worlds seems to me to only work if you add in that in every one of those possible worlds, God chooses to create the agent with a certain nature, and that nature delimits the choices from which that agent may choose, and then he chooses to actualize the one possible world in which that so delimited agent chooses the choice they choose. So God seems to be every bit as involved in determining what choice the agent's going to do as in a straightforward determinism like yours or mine. Yes, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, you could, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but you could almost break this down into two different ways in which God has determined things, right? In one way, he's determined the nature of the agent such that it would make the choices that it would make, although freely. And then number two, he's actualized each of the events, which presumably he would have to determine, right? The non-free events, right? So in other words, we have the actualization of the timeline itself and then the creation of the nature. So that's two different delimitations, right? The nature delimits everything down to what the free agent would freely choose. And then the events that actually take place in the timeline he actualized would dictate which of those choices he would actually make. Is that accurate?
Right. So yeah. So like, God might choose to create, in some number of possible worlds, God would choose to create an agent with a particular nature. And by virtue of the subjunctive choice to create the agent with that nature, that delimits the number of possible choices and even the number of feasible choices that agent would choose to make. So God is already limiting, by virtue of how he's creating the agent in this possible world, the choices that person might make. And then you're right. Then there's yet another layer of delimiting when God actualizes the one world from among the few that are determined by that first set of delimiting that God does. And so and this delimiting guarantees one particular outcome and no other. So yeah, it all seems to boil down to the same thing in my eyes.
See, and now, and again, correct anything where I'm wrong here, or maybe making it weaker or anything like that. But if I take this back to my original thought of, if God actualizes timeline A, event A will occur, and God has actualized timeline A, therefore event A will occur, and that this creates two things. Number one, a situation in which only event A can take place. Event B would have to have timeline B actualized. And number two, an event in which, or a situation in which, if event A is evil, that would mean evil event A would have to take place, rather than potentially good event B or so on, if event A, or excuse me, if timeline A was actualized. So that's the original thought. But now you have, I think, underneath that an explanation of, okay, well, what exactly does it mean to actualize timeline A such that event A would happen? And if this argument is true, and if I'm understanding it correctly, what it means to actualize event A is, number one, to create a certain nature in the agent, and number two, to create a certain set of circumstances so that the agent would choose freely to act in a certain way based on the nature which God has already established. Which, in my opinion, go ahead.
Well, just to be fair, though, apart from the creation of that agent and all the agents that influence him with their particular natures, a lot of the influences he doesn't have to determine. Right? He can, a lot of the influences upon the agent's choice won't be delimited, at least not in quite the same way as we're talking about these other things. So in my mind, the key issues here are that, number one, God is severely restricting the number of options available to an agent by creating them with a particular nature in any given possible world, and then he's further delimiting what they do by choosing one of the remaining few possibilities to actualize. To what extent this is any less deterministic than compatibilism, it's not clear to me.
Well, what it sounds to me like is it's even, I wouldn't say more compatibilistic, but at least equal, and it could be more compatibilistic, because essentially what it seems to suggest to me is that, again, the way that God actualizes the timeline is with the actualization of a certain set of events and also a certain nature. And with
he actualizes a world that contains a sequence of events, and right. He creates the agent with a particular nature such that agent finds him or herself in conditions that obtain at some point after the actualization of that world. And he creates a whole bunch of other agents with the natures they have that result in influencing this agent to make the decision he does.
Right, and I do appreciate the technical precision there, because that is very important. But so then what that leads to is inevitably, and we were calling this event A, right? And it could be, all the different events that happen in this timeline, but those events happening with a level of inevitability that effectively, in my opinion, renders them fatalistic. Because if you don't actually have a situation in which the agent, because the events, the nature delimits it to such an extent that only a certain number of choices are available. And the events in the timeline that have been actualized based on all the different factors that are there delimit that even further, such that only one choice is actually made. It seems to me like that is pure fatalism, that says each event that takes place has to take place from the moment of the actualization event, which would be creation. And at that point, not only do I not understand how Molinism isn't deterministic, I would even go as far as to say God intimately knows the actions of each individual and then chooses to actualize those actions based on whatever purposes they happen to be, which in the case of William Lane Craig, he often says that it's to save the maximum number of people with the lowest amount of evil. I'm sure that's not a universal Molinist understanding, but the point is, it seems to me like they're saying exactly what we are, which is God intimately knows all the knowledge or all the evil that will happen before creation, determined it would be that way rather than another way, but did so for his own righteous purposes. And if there's anything that seems unfair or wrong there, definitely correct me for sure.
No, I mean, I think it, like I said, I think it boils down to just our view. It's just offering a very convoluted mechanism that it seems we don't need. You know, I have to go here in a minute, but what I want to leave you with is this, and then you can continue to talk, obviously. But I think, here's the thing. A lot of Calvinists seem to affirm a kind of determinism that I think is prone to the objections of non-Calvinists. And that is a kind of causal determinism in which either one of two things happens. Either we are physically determined, meaning that our what appear to be choices are merely the effects of our neurons in our brains firing in a certain way, caused to do so by the sensory organs receiving stimuli from the outside environment, etc. And this is just the latest effect in a long chain of cause and effect stretching back to the Big Bang. And in that view, I don't see how human beings are any different from puppets. Or from a domino, right? It's just God tips over the first domino and boom, 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 boom until it gets to your choice, which isn't really a choice at all. The other option I see a lot of Calvinists make is that, yeah, God creates agents with a nature that guarantees they do such and such thing. But arguably, that's just as problematic. God is still causing the sin in a more foundational way than the agent is. Well, so this is why I reject causal determinism. I don't allow, like I got on Dr. Stratton's case on the phone for calling my view causal determinism. And that's a whole other conversation he and I are going to continue to have, because he said at one point that my determinism just sounds like libertarianism. And I'm like, I don't think so. But anyway, what I want to say is that perfectly foreordaining, predetermining all events in space-time doesn't seem to me to require that God is causing those things. And the analogy I give is the analogy of the author of a story and the world of the story. So imagine, this is going to sound out there, but imagine for a moment that simply by virtue of conceiving of a novel, the author actually creates the world in which that whose timeline that novel records. All right? So J.R.R. Tolkien, let's say, simply by conceiving of the whole story of Middle-earth, which he fleshed out over time in writing in The Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbit and The Silmarillion and so forth, simply by virtue of conceiving of the world of Middle-earth and everything that takes place therein, Tolkien creates the world of Middle-earth and everything that takes place therein. Now, in this hypothetical scenario I've offered, when Sam and Frodo, after their long travels, finally get to Mount Doom, and Sam is urging Frodo to throw the One Ring into the fires of Mount Doom to destroy it, Frodo decides not to, and thankfully, Gollum jumps out and wrestles the ring away, and then falls with it into the fire. But that's not the point. The point is that Frodo freely makes a choice not to throw that ring into Mount Doom. Now, granted, his choice was influenced by a number of factors, including the One Ring's own power, but nevertheless, and here's the critical thing, Tolkien isn't causing Frodo to make that choice at the time he makes the choice. It's not as if Tolkien is writing the world of Middle-earth at the moment that Frodo decides not to throw the ring into the fire. No, God transcendently wrote, Tolkien transcendently conceived of the world of Middle-earth in a completely disconnected timeline, our real one. And so at the moment that Frodo decides not to throw the ring into the fire, there's nothing forcing him, certainly not J.R.R. Tolkien, to do what Tolkien has nevertheless decreed, foreordained, predetermined Frodo to do by virtue of conceiving of the world of Middle-earth. That is the way I conceive of the relationship between God and creation. Yes, God has dictated, decreed, foreordained, predetermined everything that will take place in our time. He has indeed done that. And logically, it follows that everything that takes place in space-time will happen exactly as he decreed it. Okay? However, it does not follow, logically from that God is causing those things to happen. He creates the world, yes, and he has decreed that the world he creates will happen in a certain way. It will unfold in a certain way. But he doesn't have to be causing it, actively causing it or setting off a series of dominoes or anything. And so, on my view, I can't explain how God guarantees that what he has decreed obtains. But simply by decreeing that something will obtain, and that being the logical basis for which the thing is guaranteed to come about, doesn't follow from that therefore God is causing it. And so this is my way. And here's the thing. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, that what I've just offered is sensible. It's plausible. Well, how are agents any less free in what I've offered than in Molinism? They're not, as far as I can tell. And meanwhile, we don't have to jump through all these convoluted gymnastics of possible world semantics and feasible world semantics and so on and so forth. It seems to me to be, my solution seems to be a much more elegant, much more straightforward explanation. So anyway, I really do have to go, CJ, but I just wanted to leave you with that to think about, and maybe you and your viewers can talk about it a little bit more. But anyway, that's that argument that I gave about God, the grounding objection being solved by just including the hypothetical creation of the agents in those possible worlds. While I think that solves the problem, I also think it just reduces Molinism to compatibilism anyway. So yeah, anyway, hopefully that was all helpful. I don't know if it will, but maybe time will tell.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you very much for stopping by here today. I am going to just briefly reiterate the argument here after you leave, and then also just give some of the channel housekeeping again before we head out. Right. But nonetheless, I do greatly appreciate you showing up here. And also, of course, feel free to do any further videos or clip this video or anything like that.
Awesome.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you very much for having these conversations with me as well, because it did help a lot. I think this was a pretty illuminating couple of thoughts, and I think it'll get more robust as time goes on, because so far it's a very short number of thoughts that really only began about a week ago and really only got going today. So you know what I mean? It's like this is hopefully going to be a much more profound thing later. But I appreciate you tremendously. God bless you.
My pleasure. And I know that one or more people in the chat were asking if they could get a hold of me. My email address is chrisdate@rethinkinghell.com. Super easy to reach me, and I'd be happy to talk. So I'll see you later, CJ.
Absolutely. So briefly, I want to just reiterate again this idea, right? So the first thing, which I had originally postulated here, which is if God actualizes timeline A, then event A will occur. God has actualized timeline A, therefore event A will occur. There was the notation that the actualization of timeline A is an immutable antecedent, which means it's not subject to change. For example, a bachelor can become not a bachelor by getting married. You can't have God actualize timeline B in our timeline, right? In other words, timeline A is always going to be what is actualized if timeline, as far as timeline A is concerned, right? It's kind of hard to word that because obviously God could create multiple worlds hypothetically if he wanted to, right? So that's not what I mean. But what I mean is just simply as far as our perspective is concerned, he's not like recreating the timeline over and over again, right? So it's an immutable antecedent. And what it would mean for God to actualize timeline A, as Chris pointed out in a much more robust fashion than I am right now, but is number one, that God would create the agent with a nature such that they would have a certain set of decisions which they may freely choose. And number two, that God would create a world with a certain series of events such that the agent would choose one particular option, namely event A in the syllogism, right? And the conclusion is, number one, and again, I would like anybody to attack this, improve upon it, tell me where I'm wrong, tell me if I'm doing something right and Chris is doing something wrong, or Chris is doing something right and I'm doing something wrong, which that second one is much more likely. Chris is actually super good at this kind of stuff, right? But nonetheless, the conclusion then is that Molinism is just as deterministic as any form of compatibilism. And you could really break that conclusion down into two separate things that I want to point out, right? Which is number one, that in the timeline which exists, the agent can only actually do the one option, namely that which was actually that event A, right? Excuse me. So in the real world, which was actualized, the agent can actually only do event A. If they were to do event B, then it would have had to have been timeline B, which was actualized, right? And that's the first thing I want to point out is that the free choice there, if you consider the fact that the free choice is based on the nature that God created, as well as the nature, as well as the series of events was led up to that moment in time, right? Since it effectively always will lead to one inevitable choice, it seems kind of moot. It seems rather deterministic, right? And that was the first point. And the second point is, since a whole bunch of the different decisions that are made are evil decisions, and since God foreknew all of these decisions beforehand, so you also have the foreknowledge thing in play, God not only intimately foreknows everything that will happen in timeline A, but actualizes it anyway, rather than a timeline in which these different evil events would not happen. But also, since conclusion number one, it was impossible for the agent to have chose anything other than that in that, or excuse me, I don't know if impossible is the right word, but the agent could not have chosen anything other than would have been actualized in that timeline. Otherwise, the other timeline would have had to have been actualized, right? Since that is the case, that means that God not only intimately knew, but actually foreordained that particular act of evil to occur and did so for his own righteous purposes. Now, the conclusion to all of this is simply this. If your system is designed to deny certain things and uphold other things, for example, if it is designed to uphold the idea of libertarian free will and deny the idea that God would have to somehow, some way ordain evil, right? Meaning decree evil, meaning that he decided that it was more fitting for his purposes that a world with evil existed rather than a world without evil existed, right? If it ends up failing in those events, then essentially the philosophy is useless, right? So that's all that I have here. Definitely want to hear all the criticisms and stuff like that. I'm going to be continuously thinking about this and writing it out on Word so that I can read it and read it over again and read it over again and see if there's anywhere that I'm failing here. Hopefully this will be an interesting conversation to get started. But with that, I want to go ahead and say shalom to you all. Thank you very much for being here. If you are here, please remember to like and share this video, and please consider subscribing to this channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time we go live. If you do want to help with turning this into a career, if you think that this apologetics content is worth it and that I actually do a decent job of representing our Lord and Savior in the Bible and these sorts of things, please do, with trepidation, consider giving either by subscription to the Patreon or one time to the PayPal. Again, do so with trepidation. We want to make sure that there is absolutely no harm done to your finances, right? So that's an important thing, but then also an incredibly important thing. You want to make sure that there's actually something worthwhile to be propping up here, right? So don't just give because, I think that she's kind of a cool dude or something like that, right? Also want to remind you guys the different debates we have coming up. December the 9th on Standing for Truth. We're going to be debating the subject of whether or not Jesus, is fully God and fully man. That's going to be, again, December the 9th on Standing for Truth, and I'm debating with Tested by Fire, Your Way or Yahweh. December the 18th, I'm teaming up with Jonathan Sheffield on Myth Vision to debate against Doctors Maggie Bryson and Josh Bowen about whether or not the Exodus did occur. And on December the 27th, I'll be on The Gospel Truth to talk with Rob Rowe about whether or not the Bible allows for death before the fall. Also, again, to re-announce for the first time, I guess it'll be the second time since the first time since the beginning of this video, but nonetheless, on July the 2nd, on Standing for Truth, I will be debating with Tyler Vela on the question of whether or not Genesis 1 teaches any sort of scientific facts. Basically, Genesis 1 and concordism. And those are all hopefully going to be very interesting and fun debates. So, shalom, guys. Love you in the Lord. God bless you all. Leave questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, any other, apologists out there, anybody like that who wants to comment on this, please do. Let's get the conversation started. And I'm going to get out of here. And if the Lord wills and tarries, we'll see you here soon.